it's the I don't want to be perceived as looking bad at this, and I suffer from that for a long time, the not trying new things. And I know some people like that too, who will literally not try something new because the fear of not being good at it or not excelling at it, and how that will present itself is just too much for them. Can you imagine that? Are you like that? That is an example of how we can hinder vulnerability in our lives. What is up, lifters and listeners? Welcome back to the Lift Her Up podcast. I am your host, Latrice. And if you have been watching for a while or listening for a while, then welcome back. And if it is your first time tuning in, then just welcome. Thank you all again for your continued support in liking, sharing, and subscribing. I don't know what count we are at right now with the subscribers on YouTube, but the number is steadily going up, and I am still in awe at what the Lord is doing here. And I'm glad that you all have found it relatable and enjoyable, and I hope that you continue to rock with your girl. So thank y'all again for the support for Fear of Intimacy. The second part just went up last week. I hope you have enjoyed it. And this week, I am still on the topic of fear, not with intimacy, but with something that is very, very close to it. I did not intentionally keep this fear track going. The Lord I feel like he has me in a fear series right now. Fear of Intimacy 1 and 2, Fear of God. And now today we'll be talking about the fear of vulnerability and how we should be leading with vulnerability in our lives. So we talked about intimacy, and today we're going to discuss vulnerability. And the idea, the topic idea for this, for me, it came up a couple weeks ago. I've been having some conversations, and I realized that when I leave conversations with people, generally I leave learning more about the other person or people, and I don't leave with people learning more about me usually. And that's not something I intentionally do for the most part. Sometimes it is withholding, but for the most part, it's completely unintentional. So I've been challenging myself, and I've been trying to do this really beyond over the last few months, but trying to challenge myself to be more open and vulnerable when I'm having conversations with people, when I interface with people, just within group settings, and even talking to people one-on-one, all of that, just opening up more about who Latrice is and who I am. And of course, in the midst of that, when I'm learning these habits that I've had, the Lord will speak to me and give downloads. And he shared with me that my fear of vulnerability and being open with people is connected to a fear of criticism, which we gonna talk a little bit more about that later, sharing some personal stories and things like that. But I wanted to talk about fear of vulnerability because it is different from a fear of intimacy. The thing is, the two words are normally used interchangeably, like they're synonymous for one another, but they really aren't. And I think that vulnerability has a greater impact on intimacy than vice versa, actually, because you can be intimate with someone, and I'm not talking physical here, but emotionally, in a place of intimacy with them, but you still not be your most vulnerable with them, if that makes sense. So we're going to discuss vulnerability today. So the definition of vulnerability is the willingness to show emotion or to allow one's weaknesses to be seen or known. Okay. So struggling with vulnerability, it's not just when we withhold information about ourselves, and it's not just holding back or not revealing too much about ourselves, but it can also be when we avoid asking for help, when you have a difficulty saying no, when you avoid trying new things, so not trying new things, not admitting when you have a fear of something, and not being accountable for your mistakes. So I found that list and I thought that was pretty, not astonishing, but pretty intriguing. It was very interesting to me because I never considered the asking for help aspect of vulnerability and not trying new things, and the accountability aspect of it. So when we talk about asking for help, it's like you're avoiding asking for help because you don't want to be portrayed as weak. And the same thing for the accountability and the trying new things. It's the I don't want to be perceived as looking bad at this. And I suffer from that for a long time, the not trying new things. And I know some people like that too, who will literally not try something new because the fear of not being good at it or not excelling at it, and how that will present itself is just too much for them. Can you imagine that? Are you like that? That is an example of how we can hinder vulnerability in our lives. So the roots can also be the fear of rejection and of abandonment. And many perfectionists, I am a recovering perfectionist, okay, can suffer from this fear of vulnerability and struggle with it. And it can also stem from abusive relationships and or criticism from family in your upbringing. So this is when I want to bring up my personal story again. I can definitely attest to that criticism part and relate to it heavily. When I was in college, and I've probably been struggling with this way longer than that, but I remember specifically in college, I was very insecure. I think that's the best word. Insecure as a person. I just didn't know myself at all. So I remember having to, or in my mind, I would be overthinking and over analyzing really who I was and how I was perceived by other people. So I just thought I was just too boring of a person. Honestly, this is legit how I thought. And within my friend group, I always tried for there to be at least two of us, including myself, three. So at least two people to hang out with, three of us, so that there could be a buffer in between, so I wouldn't have to be alone with just one of my friends, but it would at least be three of us, so that way it would kind of help to mask the fact that maybe A, like I didn't have that much to talk about, or B, like I wasn't that exciting of a person, or I didn't hold conversation as well as another, or just not like really an exciting person. So I always tried for there to be at least three of us if we hung out, because I was just so insecure. And it stemmed from that criticism that I would face as a kid, because I would just be so scared that people would judge me for being boring or not thinking like them or not talking like them, or the list goes on and on. And I still have a hard time with this today sometimes, where I'll have conversations with people and I'll be so scared to say the wrong thing, and it feels like a shame or an embarrassment. And so if I do happen to say the wrong thing, whatever, it's like it stays in my brain and it ruminates there and just lingers over and over, and I'm replaying the scene over and over again in my head, and it makes me want to not be vulnerable, and it makes me not want to speak up a lot of the times, because I'm having to fight against those thoughts. And it's because, again, that criticism, I developed a very loud and a very strong inner critic from a young age, like do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. They're going to laugh. They're going to hate it, blah, 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 blah. So that voice is so loud in my mind. I've quieted her now a bit, but whenever an opportunity for vulnerability presents itself to me, even an opportunity just to express myself, I'm very calculated with how I respond to things. And that might be off-putting to some people, but I'll notice different comments that people say about me or around me or whatever. But it's only because I'm very thoughtful when I say words because of that critical past. So that's just a way that vulnerability can impact us. And again, it's something that I'm breaking free of. I think I'm definitely better today than I was last year, and definitely the year before that, and most definitely in college, because I was not even checking for Jesus in college, y'all. So like, can you imagine? But yeah, so that is my bout of criticism and vulnerability. Just a little bit of it. But that is why it makes me uncomfortable at times, because I get into that critical mode. But what are some other reasons that people find vulnerability uncomfortable? So first thing is that it exposes the potential weaknesses and even, again, the appearance of a weakness, and exposes them to judgment, exposes us to rejection and potential hurt. Also, we want to avoid looking overly emotional, looking as if we overly care about a situation or someone or something. I can also greatly identify with that as well. When you are not given the best tools when you're growing up about how to emotionally regulate yourself, and the people around you don't necessarily know how to do that best as well, the tools that you're given, it may not be enough to it may not be enough for you to learn how to express yourself emotionally and communicate what your emotions actually are. So for me, that led to me shutting down emotionally, because I did not want people to think that I was too emotional just because I was vulnerable in a moment, if that makes sense. Also, the fear of relinquishing control and the fear of being seen and known. I think I want to do an episode about that. The fear of being seen, because I feel like there's a lot to touch on that topic. But vulnerability also requires a level of self-awareness and emotional maturity, which many of us do not have. We, again, don't have the tools to process our emotions properly and to express them and communicate them effectively. And sometimes it takes for you to have to sit in emotions and for you to identify, wow, I feel this way and this is the reason why. Now allow yourself to verbally express that and communicate that with others, and for you to listen to other people do that as well. That's a big component. Also, why it makes people uncomfortable is because with God, when we're vulnerable with Him, we are exposing ourselves in a different way. Spiritually, we're exposing our sin to Him, even though He already know it. But a great example of this in the Bible, a biblical character that is A1 at exposing themselves, okay? David, yep, outside of Jesus, David. So Psalm 51, that's why I love the Psalms. Right after David's whole ordeal with Bathsheba and Uriah, okay? He wrote Psalm 51, and I wrote down verse 1-4 here. Be gracious to me, God, according to your faithful love, according to your abundant compassion, blot out my rebellion. Completely wash away my guilt and cleanse me from my sin. For I am conscious of my rebellion, and my sin is always before me. Against you, you alone, I have sinned and done this evil in your sight. So you are right when you pass sentence. You are blameless when you judge. And again, that's Psalm 51. And that just goes to show how honest David was with the Lord before the Lord about his sin. He admitted it. He repented of it. He cried about it. He said, Lord, I'm wrong. You're right. This is terrible thing that I've done. It was honest. It was raw. It was vulnerable. And that is literally, David wrote most of the Psalms. So there are so many times that he is crying out to the Lord in despair during all these horrendous moments that he's going to, whether he was hiding from Saul or about to be killed by Saul, or his enemies that are trying to overtake him countless times throughout his kingship. But he openly admitted to God before a holy God that he had sinned. And that's exactly what we need to do with the Lord, is to openly say our sin before him and to repent of it and to be honest about it so that we can move forward and grow. So now let's talk about the downside of vulnerability, of having no vulnerability, So when we don't have vulnerability, when we don't practice it, we are unable to cultivate meaningful relationships and connections. We are not able to show up as our most authentic self. We make copies of ourselves. We alter the copies. We are like, oh, well, I like this part about myself, but I don't like that part. So then we put on a mask and pretend to be somebody else with additions of ourselves, but not our full selves. The lack of vulnerability can also lead to disobedience. So when you don't show up and God has called you to show up to something in a certain way and you're not obedient to that, then that's the issue. That's a problem. It also hides our gifts and our talents. Our personality is a gift from God. How he made us, the way we smile, the way we laugh, our humor, all those things, that is a gift from God. So when we choose to not lean into that gift, when we choose to withhold that from people, it's like we're depriving people of experiencing literally a gift from God that God has given us. We're limiting the experience that people have of us. And we are also limiting ourselves and our potential and our quality of life. So since most of us desire for God to do grand things in our life, we desire for the huge blessings and the promises to be fulfilled in our life. But most of us don't want to be honest, and most of us don't want to be vulnerable and tell God what's really going on in order for him to bless us for real, because the Lord he can't bless something that's artificial. Just like I was saying just now, if you want something real, then you have to give something real in return. Because if he gave you a blessing based on who you were presenting yourself to be to him, it wouldn't really be your blessing. So yeah, like let's consider that. Let's think about that. Give the Lord something real to work with. How can we activate our vulnerability muscle with God and with others? It's always going to start with us. Vulnerability is always going to start with you. We always need to be aware and honest within self, just like David, where he admitted the sin first. We have to be the same way. We have to be vulnerable with ourselves. And I wrote down here, trigger yourself. That sounds so crazy sometimes, but we really have to, because what the Lord was telling me, and this is true for myself too. So many of us, like, we live outside of ourselves. We have no GPS to really how we're feeling at any moment's notice. We're out of touch with ourselves and our wants and our desires so much. And it's no wonder why we can't maintain healthy relationships with other people and a consistent relationship with God, because we can't even locate ourselves. So we have to be in touch with with our internal. What are we needing? What are we desiring with our internal problems? We cannot continue to ignore issues that are obviously present, because just because you ignore something, you don't give it attention, that does not mean that it's starving from the attention. That's not what that means. And it does not make it any less of an impact just because you ignore a problem. We also have to become curious about what God wants us to work on and what he wants us to pay attention to. So I read this earlier where journaling out and asking God about the different things that he may be doing in your life or that you may have missed. So if you pray and you ask God, Lord, what have I missed lately? Have you been doing something in my life that I've been too distracted to pay attention to? Is there an area that you want me to pay more closely attention to? Like, I don't want to miss it. So help me to see it. And Lord, correct me where I'm wrong. And recently I was thinking about doing an episode about relational conflict. And this came to my mind as I was thinking about this, but it prompted this question. It was prompted by this question that I read that said, how has my sin hurt other people? And it's very alarming question, I think. And I think that it's very vulnerable because it's able for us to pinpoint sin within ourselves while also acknowledging the hurt that we can cause other people from our actions. So that's a way for us to be vulnerable and to look empathetically at other people through vulnerable eyes as well. So I thought that was a good question to consider in regards to vulnerability. And while the Lord is highlighting what your sin might be, you can also ask him to highlight the strength in your personal vulnerability. So scripture says that his strength is made perfect in our weakness. So that must mean that there is a strength within our vulnerabilities. If God is saying that he'll make it perfect, his strength will be amplified in our weakness. So we have to lean into vulnerability because it's actually a lot stronger than what we think it is. When the world tells us that vulnerability is a weakness, but God is telling us that our weaknesses are made strong in him, we have to believe what he said versus what the world says. And there's a wisdom to vulnerability. There definitely is. There's a time, there's a place for everything. There's a crowd, there's an audience. Everything isn't appropriate to share all the time and with everybody. So there is a wisdom to vulnerability, but the vulnerability that I'm speaking of is really just the trying aspect of trying to open up to other people, because so many of us ask for godly friendships and godly relationships, and we want the crew that we go to brunch with, right? And we want to hang out with our church friends on Sundays after service. We want to do all those things. We want to build these communities. We want to build these ministries that work with people. But in order for us to connect, we have to pierce vulnerability. We have to connect in a way that's beyond just what we see on the outside, on the similarities that we have on the outside. And I think the Lord is putting us in that place where he's challenging a lot of us to just be more vulnerable. To not just focus on the surface level, to go deeper in every aspect, in all the aspects, all the time. So that is the fear. Of vulnerability. And please don't let your fear of being judged or criticized or hurt or rejected, don't let it take you away from developing amazing relationships with people. Don't let it hinder your deepening of a relationship with God either. You are free to share your desires, your inspirations, your wants, your hurts, your needs, really with anyone. But God is definitely safe with him. It is for sure safe with him. And if you want other people to be vulnerable with you, then it may help them to have a model first. So when I want to see a behavior in someone who is close to me, I try to lead with that first. So I cannot be expecting someone to sacrifice something for me if I have not first shown them that I'm willing to sacrifice something for them. So oftentimes the way that I challenge myself is I lead. When I desire someone to be vulnerable with me, I try to lead with that action. So I will try to lead with vulnerability myself if that's something that I'm asking or expecting from someone else, because it helps to have a model there. So if I'm willing to risk a little bit, then I'm hoping that they're able and willing to risk a little bit as well. And it's been rewarding for me in the relationships that I've done it in. It's been very rewarding. And it's also been rewarding in my relationship with God, because when you're able to be vulnerable to the most raw that you've ever felt with the Lord, it's like a deeper worship that you're brought into. It's a deeper level of loving and serving to him. So it is rewarding. It is rewarding. And we cannot continue to say we want these relationships, but not be willing to sacrifice and put forth the effort that God may be wanting us to, all because it makes us uncomfortable or all because it triggers our fight or flight. So that is why I believe the Lord has me in a season of talking about these different fears in regard to our connections to one another, because we need each other. We truly need each other. And vulnerability is not a weakness. It's not a weakness. It is the absolute strength. It is an absolute strength. And when we're able to focus it in the right way, it can take us to new heights in all of our relationships that we're not even aware of. So please exercise your vulnerability muscle. Try to lead with it. It doesn't have to be your whole life story, but you can lean in to the vulnerability, and I promise that the Lord, he will reward you. He'll reward you for it. And you'll begin to develop all these new relationships and deepen the ones that you have when you start to press in a little bit more and relinquish that fear. So that's our episode on today, you guys. I hope that you enjoyed. A lot more content will be coming soon. I promise. But y'all continue to like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment down below if you're someone who kind of struggles with vulnerability and getting past that vulnerable bubble. Let me know in the comments and we can pray together. Per usual, I love to hear from you guys. But until next time, stay encouraged. Bye.